Okay, so let's look at some important biological macromolecules. And some of these are going to be important because they're the main food sources that we ingest. Okay, and another one is going to be the main component of genetic information. Okay, so let's look at carbohydrates first. So carbohydrates that we typically will find in many food sources, just look at the labels on any food sources that you eat. You're almost invariably going to see carbohydrates in there. And carbohydrates are just long strands of sugar molecules that are bound together. So in actual fact, when you're eating a bowl of pasta, you could almost see it as eating a bowl of sugar. Okay? Because the body is going to break down the carbohydrate strands and it's going to break it down into simple sugars, which it's going to use as energy. Okay? And if it doesn't use it as energy, it's going to take the glucose molecules and it's going to store it for later energy. And where does the body store sugars? It makes its own strands of long sugar molecules called glycogen. And glycogen is stored in the liver. Okay? What about lipids, which are typically triglycerides? So triglycerides we'll see a molecule of coming up. But so there's three fatty acid chains that are attached together with a glycerol molecule. And that's what we would call a triglyceride, which is a fat molecule. Okay? Another important component of our food, and the body can definitely break this down as well, or it can store it, right? It can store it in fat cells around the body. If it doesn't want to store it, it can break it down. And what's it going to break it down into? It's going to break it down into fatty acids, which are the single chains that are in the lipid. And then finally, it'll break it down even further so that it can be used for energy. Okay? What about proteins that you eat? So proteins are usually found in vegetables, lentils, all kinds of food sources, muscle, so meat is high in protein. And the protein, again, that you eat will be broken down to its individual components, which are called amino acids. And the body can take those amino acids that you've eaten in the form of protein and make its own proteins that it wants to make. Okay, so all of these can be eaten, all of them can be broken down and used for energy, and all of them can be broken down and used to be stored. So carbohydrates stored as glycogen, lipids stored as fat in fat cells, proteins are broken down to individual amino acids, and then they're used to rebuild or to build new proteins in the body. Okay, and most of this is taking place in a very large organ of the body that's basically the metabolic center of the body called the liver. Okay. Nucleotides. Well, nucleotides are the bases, so the small building blocks of DNA and RNA. And DNA, so deoxyribose nucleic acid, and RNA are the genetic information of the body, and we'll talk more about that. Okay. Okay, so we'll just continue along the same lines here because these are important concepts, and then I'll show you the molecular structure of each one so it makes a bit more sense. But as mentioned, carbohydrates are really just long strands of sugar in the body, in your food source, right? So what are carbohydrates made of? Long strands of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so your meal of pasta was really just long strands of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that can be broken down into simple sugars that can be used as energy in the body. Okay, or if the body says, I have enough energy right now, I'm going to store my sugar, my glucose, as energy for later on. It can store it as glycogen in the liver. And glycogen is just long strands of sugars. Okay. If your sugar stores were full, so your glycogen stores were full in your liver, the body can say, you know what? I have extra sugar. I'm going to convert the sugar or the glucose to fat. I'm going to make fat. And I'm going to store fat in my fat cells, in my adipose tissue. Okay, so the body wants to keep all forms of energy in case you decide not to eat one day, and then it can utilize its stores. Okay, so the main sugar store in the body is glycogen, and it typically will last for days if you're not eating. Your body will just gradually break down glycogen into glucose and use its stores of glycogen. Okay, what about lipids? Well, lipids are just fats that are eaten. They also make up the main. They are the main components of the cell membrane. Remember, phospholipids, right? With that phosphate head and the lipid tail, they make up the cell membrane of every cell in the body. But fats that are eaten, again, they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? In chains. The body will break them down, and it will either use them as energy or store them in fat cells, okay? And use them for another day when you haven't eaten enough or your body wants to mobilize the fat. Nucleic acids, as I mentioned, again, look at the typical elements that all of these are made of. Nucleic acids are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, okay, just like lipids and carbohydrates, but they also have nitrogen and phosphorus. And they are the building blocks of every cell's DNA and RNA, which is the genetic information of the individual cell, okay? So basically every cell in your body has DNA in the nucleus, and the DNA is the genetic information that sends out RNA as a messenger to make specific proteins, and we'll talk about that more, okay? How about proteins? Well, proteins are just long strands of amino acids, just like carbohydrates were long strands of sugars. And amino acids, they're all made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and they have a nitrogen base with them. So when you eat proteins, the body can say, you know what, I want to break down that protein right down to the amino acids that it was made of, and I want to use those amino acids to make my own proteins that I need in the body. So your liver might say, I need to make more albumin, which is a very large protein in the body, and it'll break down the protein that you just ate, use the amino acids to make albumin, or an assortment of many other proteins in the body. Remember, we spoke about enzymes, which are proteins. Um, there's so many proteins in the body that are necessary for all the different functions that the body has. Okay, so you'll have muscle proteins. So whether it's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, you need proteins for them to function. So you're going to come across proteins all the time when we're talking about either what people are eating or proteins that are made by the body for specific functions. Okay, so let's just look at some molecules and how they lead to um, uh, other molecules. So amino acids, those are the building blocks of proteins. Okay, there's 21 amino acids that the body typically uses to make all of its proteins. 9 of the amino acids are what are called essential amino acids, meaning the body can't make them and you need to get them in your diet. And with those 21 amino acids, there's basically an infinite assortment of proteins that can be made because the amino acid sequences will be different and the lengths of the proteins will be different. So for example, insulin, which is a hormone secreted by the pancreas, is a tiny protein. It has a very small number of amino acids. Albumin, which is a large protein, has a long sequence of amino acids. Okay, so with those 21 amino acids, you can make a large assortment of proteins. What about fatty acids? Well, fatty acids you can get in your diet, right? The molecule above is actually, there's brackets there because it should be showing a long strand of a carbon backbone. So there might be, say, 11 carbons going out or 12 carbons. So it has the fatty acid will be a main component of the cell membrane in the form of phospholipids. So how do you get a phospholipid? Well, with the fatty acid combining with a glycerol group and a phosphate to become phospholipids. And the phosphate is the hydrophilic part of it that's facing the water, which is on the outside of the cell and on the inside of the cell. And that's why you have a biphospholipid layer, so that the fatty acid hydrophobic tails are within the cell membrane, hiding from the water. Okay, carbohydrates, right? So carbohydrates are just long strands of sugar, and they're broken down into monosaccharides. So a monosaccharide, for example, is glucose or fructose. It was originally in a long strand of carbohydrate, and enzymes broke it down to monosaccharides. And then the body can store it again, say as glycogen, as a polysaccharide, okay, for use as energy later on in case it needs it. Okay, so you always have glycogen stores in your body. A nucleotide base, well, the bases are that molecule above. You don't need to memorize the molecule, just understand the concept. So a nucleotide base is going to be the building block of DNA and RNA. And we'll get into that in more detail. So it makes more sense. Okay? So you have amino acids to make proteins, fatty acids to store fat, and also to make the phospholipid membrane, carbohydrates that'll break down to monosaccharides such as glucose, be used for the body as energy, and also to be stored as glycogen, and nucleotide bases to be used to make DNA and RNA. Okay, so this slide is just giving you an example of a protein, just to solidify your understanding. And a protein is long strands of amino acids, right? And of the 21 amino acids, they'll just combine in a sequence to make a certain protein. Some are longer, some are shorter, okay? And some act as hormones, some act as carrier proteins in the bloodstream, some act as muscle proteins. There's just an endless amount of different proteins that the body will use as basically building blocks of the body. Okay, so your bones will actually, the matrix of your bones, which is calcified with calcium phosphate, will have proteins within it that's giving it, with also giving it strength. Okay, your ligaments, your collagen, which is a protein in the soft tissue all over your body, is giving your tissue strength because it's a protein. Okay, so when a protein is made, it doesn't exist like a long strand of hair, because of the different electron forces, positive and negative. It's going to cause the protein to fold on itself and to turn into very specific structures. So as mentioned before, protein can be eaten, whether it's in the form of meat, beans, dairy. The body will take that, usually just break them down back to the amino acids, because the body wants its own proteins. And once it's made its own long strand of proteins, the proteins themselves, because of different electron charges, will fold and turn and have a very specific shape to them. Okay, so where do these proteins come from? Like how are they made in the body? Well, that's where the DNA comes in, right? So the DNA is in your nucleus. The DNA sends a message out to the cytoplasm of the cell in the form of messenger RNA or mRNA. And the mRNA is going to be the messenger that has a sequence of nucleotides on it. And when that attaches to ribosomes, which we'll talk about coming up, it can then, the ribosome can go along the mRNA and start to make a protein or a peptide. And the mRNA is basically telling the ribosome which amino acid sequence it wants exactly, because it's the information that has come from the nucleus, the DNA. Okay, so the sequence is DNA. The DNA makes a copy of mRNA. The mRNA goes into the cytoplasm, and it dictates which specific protein it would like to be made, which sequence of amino acids, and exactly how long the protein is going to be. So if we were just looking at the sequence of amino acids of a protein, we would just be talking about the primary structure, right? Just tell me the amino acids of a protein, okay? But that tells you nothing about the structure of the protein, because there's 21 amino acids, and they can combine in so many different sequences, and each one of them can have slightly different charges. The protein starts to fold on itself. And as it folds on itself, say in sheets or in helixes, it twists and turns and becomes a very specific shape. And then finally, the sheets or the helixes can combine together in a three-dimensional protein. Okay, and when one protein combines with another protein, they attach to each other, they become a quaternary protein structure. So I just think of it as, okay, I have a strand of hair, which is the protein amino acid sequence. Okay, as it starts to turn on itself and twist, because of some electric charges, it's becoming a secondary protein. And then as it really turns and folds on itself, it's forming a tertiary protein structure, which is really important, because remember, when we're talking about proteins, they need a specific structure. Say, as an enzyme, they need a specific structure to allow the substrate to fit right onto them. Okay? So proteins are often in a tertiary structure in the body. They're not in these long strands just hanging out. Okay? And finally, when one protein interacts with another protein in the body, they can form very complex quaternary structures. That's just the concept here. Okay? Okay, so what can damage a protein? Which is kind of important, right? Because we don't really want to damage proteins in our body. But if we're talking about the body, what can harm proteins? Well, heat, radiation, alcohol, or acids. So when we were talking about acidosis in the body, well, that's going to harm the protein shape. It's going to alter protein shapes in the bloodstream and in cells. Well, that's pretty serious. That's going to harm cells. It's going to harm the metabolic processes of the body. And that's why acidosis can be so deadly. Radiation, how about sunburns? Well, sunburns damage cells. They damage the proteins of the cells. They kill cells. That's why the skin sloughs off. And they actually alter and damage the DNA in the cell as well. Okay. What about heat? What if you have a very, very high fever? That can alter the functioning of proteins in your body as well. Okay. So if we were just to talk about proteins, say in a laboratory, how could we denature the protein? Meaning, we can alter its shape right back just to a single strand of its amino acids. Well, we can heat it up, we can radiate it, we can put it into some alcohol, or we can put it into some kind of acid. And in this scenario, we're looking at an egg that's basically protein, a lot of albumin, and the protein's being heated up and it's being denatured, and that's why it's turning white, right? And that's an irreversible process. Okay, in the body, high temperatures, high fevers, acidosis can cause enzymes and other proteins to be less functional. Okay, so this is just, the egg is just really an example of a protein that's denaturing from heat. So what are some protein functions in the body? Well, the first is that we eat protein as an energy source, right? So from the food that we ingest. And as I mentioned before, typically the body breaks down the proteins in the gastrointestinal tract, and it'll break it down into little peptides. So peptides are just small proteins, and it'll absorb the small peptides, or if it's broken down even more, it'll absorb the amino acids and take them and deliver them to the liver. And the liver will typically use those amino acids to build its own proteins in the body. Okay? Enzymes, well, those are just a type of protein that the body has made to be used as a catalyst in metabolic reactions in the body. Okay, an example here is a protein in the stomach called pepsin. Well, what's pepsin? It's a digestive protein, right? So it's a digestive enzyme. It'll accelerate the breakdown of certain proteins in the gastrointestinal tract. So as long as you remember that enzymes are all over the body to assist and accelerate metabolic processes, okay, which is really important for the body to keep up with all the metabolism that's taking place in the body. Okay, proteins can be hormones. What are hormones? Well, they're messages or they're messengers from one part of the body to another. So insulin that's secreted by the pancreas is used to communicate with cells to allow glucose to get into cells and be used as energy. Okay, insulin is also a signal to the liver to tell the liver to start making glycogen because there's lots of glucose in the bloodstream. Okay, so there's all kinds of hormones in the body that we'll talk about. Structural proteins that give your body structure, such as collagen that we mentioned. So if you were to pinch your skin and bring up some tissue, you're definitely lifting up some elastin and some collagen between your fingers. So those are structural proteins. What about protective proteins? So your immune system makes all kinds of proteins that are used to communicate with other parts of the immune system. And it also produces antibodies, which are basically like snipers that go and attach to antigens or foreign substances to destroy them. So the antibodies are released by certain cells in your immune system. They go and attach to foreign substances and tag them and destroy them. Okay, so those are protective proteins in the immune system. Okay, how about storage proteins? So the body doesn't just like accepting things into the body, like iron or all kinds of. It wants to maintain control in the body, and it'll use proteins to chauffeur different chemicals in the bloodstream, for example, or to store certain elements or molecules in the body. And one of them is iron. So iron gets stored in the liver with a protein called ferritin. Okay, so proteins can be used for storage. What about contractile proteins? Actin and myosin in your muscles. Okay, they interact with each other to allow contraction of muscles. Transport proteins, albumin. albumin's this huge molecule that floats around in your bloodstream. It transports a lot of molecules attached to albumin. Certain drugs are protein bound. Actually, most drugs that patients take are protein bound. Again, because the body doesn't like just chemicals floating by themselves. So there's many transport proteins. Clotting proteins. So basically all of your clotting factors, so we call them clotting factors, that end up helping your blood clot are proteins that are made in your liver. Okay? Almost any protein you can think of has been produced in your liver. The liver is the major factory of the body. Okay? What about proteins that are in every cell membrane in your body, that are used for transporting molecules across the cell membrane, or that are receptors on the cell membrane waiting for signals to attach to them to tell the cell what to do, right? So that phospholipid membrane is filled with all kinds of proteins. Some of them are channels to allow different molecules through to inside the cell. Some of them are receptors waiting for signals, say from hormones. So proteins have such a huge and varied function in the body.